So, Ciaran and I recorded another conversation, and it starts off with us discussing bonobo chimps and chimpanzees, and me recalling the cognitive tradeoff hypothesis, and basically that's where we begin our conversation. We ostensibly are talking about finite and infinite games, but really the nature of my mind is such that I keep going off on tangents and thinking of connections, and so it's a very tangential conversation, not much of a through line. We'll try to be better next time at actually sticking to a topic, but I just loved this conversation with Ciaran, and this is episode 3 of the Axiom of the Infinite Unknown. Because from what I remember, effectively these there's a research center in Japan that looks specifically at these I can't remember if it's definitely bonobos or if it's one other of the great apes, but they effectively you train them such that they realize, okay, when an image flashes up, then using a touch screen, I will then tap on where I saw the sequence and I'll get a reward for it. And they can flash these images up for half a second, maybe less time. Certainly not enough time for a human brain to be able to scan it all and remember what's going on. And input the sequence, sort of almost like just casually. The funny thing about chimps is that everything they do, it just looks so casual. It's just sort of the hand movements just everywhere, but they'll just bam, 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 and they'll get their reward, and it looks like a superhuman feat. And like I was saying, that the trade-off apparently seems to have been in our evolutionary history when we descended from the trees and everything's far more dangerous. It became almost a contingency, a requirement to better communicate between the members because of the greater danger. And with this better communication, you start to have evolutionary pressures for things like speech and language, and then and because the brain is very adaptable, but effectively evolution found a new use for this part of the brain that previously was used for this incredible to us now short-term memory, and it was co-opted to be used for what we believe is language. And that's the theory as to why these chimps, these apes, are just remarkable. And I'd like to probably just confirm which we're talking about. But
yeah, because what I'm fascinated with bonobos is that we share. So bonobos and chimps, they're very different species, but we share equal amount of genetic material with each one. So we share 90.
You know about the split, the chromosomal, the chimpanzee bonobo split. It was effectively it was the Congo River grew wide enough such that a tribe of chimps was separated, and one evolved in an area in which there was less food and more danger, so they became more violent, and then the other was more flourishing and less danger, so they became more loving, which are the bonobos, obviously.
Yeah, and if we see videos of the way that they live, bonobos, they have life figured out, man. they just hang out and chill out all day. Like,
yeah, they're so loving.
All day, and we share 98.6% of our genetic material 98.6 or 7% of our genetic material with each of them. And we're actually more closely related to them, both of them, than the African elephant is to the Indian elephant.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. So it's fascinating. And when you hear about when you see the way they live and you see the difference in the violence, especially, is that so the chimps are outrageously violent, like you mentioned there, and that's potentially the theory by this particular primatologist or evolutionary biologist, this guy Brian something I think is his name, is that's he kind of came up with that theory on the river, and I'm pretty sure it was him. And then you see the difference now, like the chimps will tear each other to bits. They have these really violent, aggressive, patriarchal societies. Yeah. Whereas bonobos live in matriarchal societies where the women run the show, and they just chill out and hang out all day. And they do use violence, but they only use violence in a Popperian manner. So
reciprocal.
They only use violence to suppress the intolerant. So right. The only thing they're intolerant of is intolerance in a kind of a Popperian manner, you know?
Yeah.
You know, Popper had that thing of the paradox of the open society, is that we could become tolerant of the intolerant and eventually turn into a dictatorship.
Yeah, exactly.
Whereas these bonobos, so there's this particular bonobo expert, let's call her, and she wrote a book that I haven't read yet, but I have the book. I might read it over the weekend. And it's called Bonobo Handshake, and she tells this story of this big strong male bonobo goes up and backhands this female queen, or not queen, but like leader in this bonobo tribe, or I don't know what to call them, troop, and backhands her across the face. And then she just kind of just coolly turns around and looks at him, and next thing 5 of her mates, other women, just gang up on this fella and chase him around and beat the fuck out of him. And they initially give him a little bit of a chase, and then he doesn't stop being aggressive, and then they really beat him up when he doesn't get the point. They beat him up so badly he almost loses his balls, his testicles.
Oh my god!
Yeah, but then everything is calm, and he never causes any more hassle. So they only use violence to suppress violence.
Right.
So that's, and I love that, because that's whereas chimps will have these war packs almost, and they'll just tear off and just rip other chimps to bits, and they'll tear each other to pieces, literally. Yeah. And as you said, it's the difference for selection of pressure, but yeah, it's an interesting insight into human nature as well, because if you look at the way humans live and what we have potential to do, between, let's say, to use a Christian language of kind of good and evil, or Buddhist language of kind of awakened or ignorant, or whatever the Buddhist equivalent to good is, whereas evil would be ignorant. And we have the ability for both, we have the ability for Auschwitz and the ability for Unit 731, and then we also have the ability for love and compassion and cooperation, So it's interesting to see that we have the ability to live, we have the ability to play the game of life with a chimpanzee or bonobo playing style, depending, and especially now when we have so much resources. It's an interesting insight into it. I've been thinking a lot about this of late. Have you ever come across the book Finite and Infinite Games?
No.
I've been playing around with this a lot recently, literally playing with it.
This is what Daniel Schmachtenberger talks about: finite games and infinite games.
Yeah, he put the seed in my head, and I can't remember, was it during the Weinstein interview, or was it in that Rebel Wisdom one? But put the seed in my head big time, and it keeps popping up and it keeps making sense. The concept keeps making sense. Sorry?
Who wrote the book?
James Carse. That's the book I'll probably actually read over the weekend. Like I'll
You can read the book very quickly.
No, really, I would take a book from the size of that book, that Infinite Games, if Finite Infinite Games, it looked like it would be, I think it's only about 200 pages. So that may end up being like 6 or 7 hours of reading, maybe.
Yeah, my problem is I make too many notes, and I end up rereading things a lot. I read a passage, I'll read maybe 2 pages, and then I think, okay, well, some really good points were made there. So I'll go over with my highlighter, and then I'll do some marginalia just about what I took from it, and then I'm reading the book twice every time I read it.
Yeah,
and so it
you're taking away way more from it. Like that's an example. Like this is me reading today. Like
that's blown out the sun. Oh right, yeah, exactly.
No,
you need a highlighter, bro.
Yeah, I kind of like the pen though. For some reason, I kind of like, because I have different, like, some, depending on the importance of the sentence, depending on the importance of it will determine how I underline it with the pen. So like, the longer it takes to make the, I don't know, indentate or the marking, then the more important the sentence is, or the phrase or the paragraph. So if it's a straight line, it's kind of important. It's worth keeping an eye on. It's worth highlighting. Whereas if it's like a zigzag line that takes longer than a straight line, then it's very important. But then if it's something obscure, like a series of circles or a series of kind of really precise dashes, then it's like really important. Like this is
It's a funny system. You could always just have 3 different colours of highlighters.
Yeah, but there's part of it that's almost, it serves as kind of a utility, because when it's so much slower to do, I'm really chewing on the sentence as I'm doing this.
Yeah, I agree. I get the same thing out of it. And when I as I'm writing what I think of it as well, I'm realizing I'm discovering what I think of it as I'm writing what I think of it sometimes. It's really interesting. It's like, whoa, my brain was chewing on this in ways that I hadn't even realized. I started trying to articulate it with a pen. Having to concretize your thoughts in that manner, you realize how abstract they previously were, until such a point as you have to make them legible in a manner that somebody else would read them. Otherwise, while they exist in your head, you're doing all of the connection and interpretation and relationship work abstractly, and so it makes sense to you. But if you were to try and articulate it, you'd realize I only have 5 different phrases which piece together in my mind in a way that actually I can't verbalize it now. So I find writing so useful for that, making notes and things.
But writing is what, I couldn't agree more. It's like you end up, especially when you reread notes or reread something you've written, it's almost like I often find that I can't believe that I wrote that.
Yeah.
It's like I didn't know I knew that.
Yeah, I know. I have basically so I use the Apple Notes app. I have a document called Learnings, and it's got 103 notes in it, and basically it's just like economics, cognitive biases, neuroscience, physics, evolution, general, vulnerable world hypothesis, Sociology, and I'll go into any one of these, and then it will be just masses of notes that then I read any one of these and I think whole brain emulation performance characteristics would be better understood than those of machine AI. It's like I've just got this whole library of things that I once thought, and it's remarkable, and sometimes it's useful. Like now we were talking about the chimpanzees with short-term memories, and I was able to just type in a few key terms in my notes because I wrote it down at the time, And yeah, it's called the Cognitive Tradeoff Hypothesis. It's Kyoto University. Chimpanzees effectively have a superhuman short-term memory, and it's being studied by this Japanese guy, and it's fascinating. It's like all I have to do is sort of vaguely remember it, and then put in the search terms, and a previous James Valaitis apparently knew loads about it and wrote about it for me. Now it's brilliant.
Yeah. Class. Yeah, I do that. I often do. I do a lot of handwritten notes and then type up important sections, especially for this big thing that I'm writing at the moment. That might be actually. Do you want to actually? Do you want to as a topic? You mentioned economics there. A topic that I've been, I suppose, wrestling with, but I think it's very, very interesting. So I came up with a new word last week, or earlier this week, trying to present a concept, and because I couldn't figure out another way of putting it, which was I was essentially looking at the somewhat, I don't know if you call it interdependency or inseparability of psychology, the individual psychology, sociological, let's say, emergent properties, politics, and economics, and that it's the individual, the society, the societal structure, especially once you go outside of small scale tribal societies. There's politics at play anytime there's a group of people. That sometimes it obviously ends up in formal institutions like you have, well, not even sometimes, but when you have large scale society that's outside of Dunbar number and all that, you end up with this formulation of some kind of hierarchical institution, whether it's totalitarian or whether it's democratic or whatever. Something emerges as a means of providing some kind of a stability and a connectivity, rather than just successful anarchy, you know.
Yeah.
So and then humans inherently need resources, physical resources in terms of material objects, obviously, and food and everything, and resources in terms of services like access to doctors and mechanics and fucking farriers to put horseshoes on, whatever. And so then it's like there's an inseparability there between those four things, and I couldn't find or think of a word to describe those four things, so I kind of just came up with this clunky word, which is Psycioponomics. So obviously it's just psychology, sociology, politics, and economics, to kind of describe an attempt to show this interplay, this inescapable interplay. And
so what have we got on the table? We've got sociology, psychology, economics, and what was the fourth? Politics. Because obviously in medicine we have the psychosocial model, the biopsychosocial model. So it sounds as though you're looking for a psychosocial economic politics model, and you want to combine that. Psychosocial polynomics.
Yes, that's what I call it. Socioponomics. PSY.
Yeah, I think that's just a bit. You almost swallow it as you're trying to say that word.
Yeah,
it's difficult to articulate. Yeah.
You could just shorten it to Psycioponomics rather than or Psychiopomics. I don't know, whatever. That's what I'm struck. But it's even. But I suppose the word itself is clunky and messy. But there's something, because let's say, for example, right, a way of illustrating this would be something along the lines of Gulag Archipelagos. So in the Gulag Archipelago by Solzhenitsyn, there's a bit in it where he describes this woman who ends up in the gulags, and she was previously a Communist Party devout member, worked in the government and all this, but then I can't remember precisely why, but she ends up getting dragged off to the gulags, And because of the economic, because of the inseparability, say, between economic and political situation of a systematic, enforced equality of outcome, that it led to this emergent societal kind of, I don't know if you call it societal cultural mimetics, something like that, that led to this kind of almost mass psychopathy within individuals. And there was like an example would be this lady, as a result, ended up being dragged off to the gulags herself. But then, because she kind of was so committed to the party and to the ideology, she convinced herself and would speak to others that the party couldn't have been wrong, and she must have done something wrong. So it must be her fault, because it couldn't be the party and it couldn't be the system, because she had devoted herself to it and kind of tricked herself into it, and then would even and then told her own daughter not to visit her in prison and to forget about her and all this. So like that's an example of like there's the economic and political situation, and this like equilibrated kind of, I don't know if you call it like this, there's this emergent situation that is neither economic nor political nor psychological nor sociological, but it's this emergent set of, I don't know if it's behaviors, actions, all of the above, attitudes that within individuals, within societies, within institutions, that becomes this, it's so hard to separate. You could look at each individual section in a silo, because that's definitely useful. But in terms of looking at the impact of one thing, like you change one set, you change a variable, and then all this other stuff interplays well, because human societies are complex systems.
How would you piece out culture from that? How would you? How does culture stand in relation to what you're trying to articulate, trying to coin term?
I think it ends up being like this. Culture kind of seems to be, I don't like a kind of an evolving reverb, like that's going back and forth and changing as it goes back and forth between the individual and the society, It's like individuals are feeding out into the culture, and then the culture is feeding back into the individual and changing the individual, and then it's just this.
And so what work is society doing for you there? What are you thinking of when you use the word society? Are you thinking of a population?
The collective that you are linked to, the collective of other individuals that you have to be linked to.
Okay, so those people upon which you're dependent, but the dependents whom share under the same political and economic system, because obviously at a globalized point we're dependent on people in China to some degree. So are you talking about precisely those people upon which we are dependent, who live underneath the same regulations and governmental system and within the same markets as we occupy? Is that the society you're talking about?
I think it's a matter of how much you zoom in, or where you draw the circle. So where do you draw the boundary? So like at the moment, in the way that our world works for someone like me or you, that we're not living in communes, we're not living in the forest somewhere by ourselves. Like we're linked to pretty much everyone on Earth for the most part, and that's so like at a you could almost think of it like in economic terms, in terms of the zoom of like micro, meso, macro. Like the macro human society is humanity itself at the moment, because we're linked to what workers are producing. Let's say in China, we're linked to. Well, obviously this virus has illustrated our link.
Yeah.
You know, so like, yeah, like we're linked to whatever fella or person ate a fucking bat kebab or a pangolin panini somewhere in fucking Wuhan, you know? And
yeah, no, so what I'm talking about though is you're talking about society, and you're talking about the interplay or the emergent phenomenon which emerges from politics, economics, the society, or what you're calling the sociological factors, and the psychology of the people, human psychology. And so when we're trying to talk about that emergent thing, we necessarily need to define the scope of them, because I think the psychology component is the role it's playing there. It's a constant. It's not a variable. It's a fixed constant. Human psychology is as it is through humans, depending on how we've evolved, but it manifests itself differently, obviously, within certain cultures. So psychology as itself can either be taken to be fixed, or we can understand it to be something that is actually, we're no longer talking about psychology when we talk about the ways in which it manifests itself in specific. We're talking more broadly when we're talking about its manifestation. We're talking about a specific psychology, depending on the context, analysing it. And therefore, each of these, the politics, we need to know the scope of that, because politics is very different from country to country. Economics, we need to know that, and economics is actually far more like culture or even genetics, in that it has evolved. An economic system, the markets have evolved from that very first time that a tribe was positioned beautifully near the river. They had access to the water they needed. They had good shelter. They had that vast river behind them, such that they could only have to focus on looking ahead of them. So that whole attack vector is no longer a consideration. But what they lack is something that in the other part of the location, there are all of these resources they don't have access to, and their tribe has already inhabited those. And so what you end up having is a situation in which you have that very first man or woman, would have been a man back then, venture into the other neighboring tribe and try to strike up a deal. Try to make that first trade, and from there you get rules of the trade, you get emergent prices, what's worth what's worth this to whom, and why is it worth it to me to trade it off, what are the values in trading, how do we build the trust in trading, and then from there that evolves, and eventually you end up with the markets that we have, and then people start to get intervening, and they think, well, you know, my reason that my evolved psychology is actually better than anything Mother Nature could have come up with, and so I'm going to try to start controlling these markets. And that's when you get, obviously, the collapses of communist states and things, when people think they can outgrow this evolved phenomenon. But what I'm saying is, we have all of these different interdependencies, so we do have a scope in which we have to define, because otherwise we're talking about too many disparate variables. I really want to help you with this because I find it really interesting. I think we just need to better scope out who we're talking about. If we're talking about economics, politics, psychology, and sociology, we need to know what the society is, what the political regime is, how the economy functions. And are we talking in human psychology, are we talking about the context dependent psychology or the evolved psychology that we share? So I'm just trying to scope it out with you, try and flesh out.
Yeah, that's very helpful, man. That's really well put. And I suppose what I've been trying to grapple with is let's say is like I suppose it's kind of influenced by the kind of thing that Schmachtenberger was talking about to Weinstein, which is like it's almost looking at the abstract. So I suppose it's looking at it in terms of, if I was to use that finite and infinite games example or concept and go, well, what way could a society, like regardless of the scale, once you go past numbers, and whether it's a million or a billion, what way can you equilibrate, or can you, if you look at, so it's not even looking at any, you can use specific, I suppose, societies that currently exist or have existed in the past historically to learn lessons from. So let's say, for example, like I mentioned, the gulags there, or you just look at like it's so many totalitarian regimes as an example, or you look at the innovation in a lot of Western nations where there's been freedom of where there's been space created for innovation to occur. Where, like, you know, Brian Callen had that phrase, I don't know where he got it from, that you can put a gun to a fella's head and tell him to move a box.
Yeah, I love that.
You can't put a gun to his head and come up with a good idea. So then it's looking at, well, like, what kind of society or equilibration can take place? Like, yeah, equilibration is maybe a way of thinking of it. Between aspects of an individual human psychology, as like that are like you mentioned, where psychology is what it is, regardless of the human, essentially. Obviously, you take a big enough population of people from anywhere over thousands of years, like, and they're going to be 1,000 people 1,000 years ago are going to be essentially going to have the same distribution of bell curve of all abilities and all this stuff that you have now. And I think humans haven't changed a whole lot. But if you look at it, what kind of equilibration can take place between an individual, between the society, between the politics, and between the economics, such that the game of navigating life, let's say, is more like an infinite game and less like a finite game.
Yeah.
What does that equilibration need to look like, from the individual to the collective? In terms of, you think about sociology, you just, and it may very well be an incorrect definition, but just the behavior of the collective. So there's the behavior or the tendencies of the individual, the behavior or the tendencies of the collective. Then there's politics that you can't separate out the politics from that, and you can't separate out the economics from that, because the individual is influenced by the collective, is influenced by the politics, is influenced by the economics. They all influence each other. So like none of them can be separated out from any of the other ones. If you're trying to look, because you look at, there's cultural behaviors at the sociological level, and then there's behaviors or norms that either are more or less equilibrated, I suppose, in a way with the sociological behaviors and the individuals within the society, that are going to make certain political structures more likely to be an infinite game than a finite game. Where like an example of the finite game is pretty obvious. You know, I think we talked about it before, of kind of revealed preferences. You know, where you have a totalitarian regime, it in the short term or maybe even medium term looks stable, but it's only because there's a load of suppressed,
falsified preferences.
Yeah. So but how do we, if you look at it from the perspective of, let's say, what way do we need to live, essentially? What way do we need to have the individual take it? So let's say if you look at just like psychology, there's going to be certain evolutionary traits left behind as a result of our legacy. There's going to be our evolutionary legacy and natural selection is going to have left us with certain tendencies and traits within individuals that are obviously going to be built. We're not all the same. We're not blank slates. We're left with stuff. So then within what we're left with evolutionarily, as an abstract human or average human or whatever, what way can you equilibrate those tendencies with societal behaviors at a sociological level, with political structures at a political level in terms of how the society organizes hierarchical structure and kind of creates a sense of, I don't know, systemized cooperation, let's say, at a institutional level, and then the economics that fit within that they're all interdependent and inseparable. So then what equilibration takes place between those four interdependent or inseparable things? And that's so, like, whereas if you change any one of those variables, let's say like the obvious variable from a communist sense or an economic sense is you decide you want to have you decide you want to have equality of outcome, let's say, because you decide that the proletariat are the heroes and the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy are the villains, and you want to take what they have and give everyone an equal amount, and from each according to their ability, to each according to their need, and so on. And then you decide that, well, like there's that Peter Thiel thing that I think you mentioned it last week, about what is the minimum amount of violence needed to. Did you mention this last week?
No, so I know what you're talking about though.
Peter Thiel, maybe once I mentioned it and we didn't talk about it, but it's like what the minimal amount of violence needed to enforce your idea. Eric
mentioned it on the podcast with Daniel Schmachtenberger. Yeah, and he said, take your beautiful idea and ask yourself how beautiful it is when you consider the minimum level of violence that's required to actually enforce it. Yeah, I think that's brilliant because
it's so beautiful. Yeah, it
absolutely rips apart communism or any sort of planned economy type of ideal, because, as you say, the coercion involved, the level of that violence, it doesn't look so beautiful when you start factoring that in.
No. So
I have a better understanding of what you're talking about now. I think to try and get
to explain this to as well, because it feels like to me that there's something there to it. Like it feels like there's a concept there, or there's an idea within this. There's an idea here. There's something to it, but I haven't been able to. But you're the first person I've tried to explain it to in any way, because I only came up with the word a few days ago, and I was trying to write about something. So,
in any very complex relationship, so I'm thinking of this as almost an equation where we've got X, Y, Z, and P, and so when you've got all of these interdependencies, how is it that you can factor out any single one of those when you can't control for any of the others? And so then you have to start, because the product of the equation is what you're talking about. It's this emergent life. It's this way of living that emerges from these four qualities. A person's existence in the modern day is for all of time. It's just that it was simpler in the past. It's dependent on the product of these four variables, and so you need to have an ability to pin some of them down. Fortunately, I do think that whilst it is that humans are incredibly adaptable, we are infantile up until our adolescence begins 16, 15. So we are infantile for a good 8 years, properly infantile. We are sponges. We are adapting so quickly, learning so quickly, that psychology is incredibly malleable, but that still can't. What you can't say is, and therefore selfishness needn't ever arise in a human that's raised well enough. Selfishness is innate, self-love is innate, but so is compassion and the desire for the other people to view your behavior as proprietary. You want the approbation and you want to avoid the disapprobation of the others around you. You act in a way that is praiseworthy, not just for the praise, but because
it feels better to do so.
but because but our psychology is such that actually praiseworthy behavior, even absent of praise, is something for which we strive as a human being. These are all things that are innate to our evolved psychology, and so as soon as you can start pinning some of those down, you can say, okay, so what do we know we need to build a system that is in accordance to some of these fixed values, and then when you can start pinning a few more things down, like, okay, whatever we come up with, it's going to have to account for the fact that very few human beings are masochistically altruistic. Very few human beings are going to sacrifice themselves for others to whom they owe nothing. So we've got to account for that. And the way you account for that is you can either say, okay, well, people won't sacrifice themselves, or you say, no, they will, so long as they feel so tied to this other person that it is worth it to them in a more grand narrative. So you've got many options that derive from that one value, and that's why it is that. So you still need to read Blueprint by Nicholas Christakis, because he talks about the blueprint to a good society. I forget what it's called. It's called Blueprint: The Evolutionary Origins of a Good Society, or something like that. Why we evolved, to be good. It's something like that. Anyway, he talks about these innate characteristics of a collective of people that actually work, and he does this remarkable thing where he studies shipwrecks, and in studying shipwrecks you can look at those people who washed ashore and actually survived it before being rescued, and those other people who ended up eating each other or killing each other or turning on each other, and you can look at their diaries and see why didn't that work, and you can look at these things. And his he has what he calls it a social suite of sort of, and encapsulation of what are the things that we know work. And then from there, you have all of this flexibility as to how you actually integrate them into what we're trying to. But in terms of the emergence you're talking about, I've veered away from it. I see why you're wanting to capture a word for the product of those four things. Whatever that equation is with those four variables, you want to assign a name to that product, because that product is upon which we depend for everything.
But you're taking the exact same, like we talked about it last week, where I kind of mentioned that alignment concept I just kind of been playing with, and that's where if you remember last week, the part of the alignment is the iterative, on an iterative basis, trying to align our evolutionary legacy with the constraints of whatever situation we happen to find ourselves with, the other constraints. So just like you mentioned there, I think I agree that it needs to start from the individual outwards, whereas something like we mentioned already, but like centrally planned socialism starts from the institution outwards, or this ideology outwards that's not grounded. It's an ideology that's based on blank slate social constructionism. It's not grounded in evolutionary biology or psychology. So the individual forces at play. You're trying to squeeze circles into squares and triangles into circles, and whereas it needs to, if you're looking at the individual units at play, are the most immovable parts, because they're the ones that partake in all the rest. And they're the things that are weird, and they're the things that are like us. We're the things that are left with certain tendencies, traits, behaviors, like you so well put a minute ago. That sounds like I need to read this book as well. And so it's like, if you work from the individual outwards in these, that's why I like the phrase equilibrated, because it reminds me of, I got it from Peterson when he's talking about Piagetian concentric circles, and this equilibrated state between what's good for the individual is only good for the individual if it's good for the closest friends and family, in such a way that it's good for the community, in such a way that it's good for the nation, in such a way that it's good for humanity, in such a way that you can include nature, in such a way that it's good for nature. So there's this equilibration. So between the individual and all the constraints in the system. So then if you take that kind of a lens and you look at it, well, what does that even look like? And then it dials right back down to individual psychology, collective properties or collective behavioral or attitudinal properties, then the political structures that are involved in navigating large scale or any kind of society, and then how resource distribution and allocation and production takes place within that. And then but then it's the individual outwards, because they're the parts that we're left with, just like you mentioned there. So an example economically would be two major reasons why centrally planned socialism, let's say, is obviously a ridiculous idea, is because just two reasons would be, at an individual level, the individuals at play can neither, one, genuinely have a deep emotional connection to people outside of their Dunbar's number, and then two is that they can't track others for contribution and acquisition from the economy. So because you can't track 1 billion Russians or 100 million Russians or however many people are in Russia, like, or fucking, if you're in any communist or socialist or centrally planned socialist society, you unless you're living in a group of 100 people on a ship and a like you mentioned there, like a shipwreck or whatever, where you know everyone, you can track everyone, you're aware of everyone's contribution and acquisition from the resource production and allocation, then you can track that. And you can also, that's married with the ability that you genuinely can care for them. So because they're within your Dunbar's number. So there's enough people to track on an emotional level and track on a resource contribution and acquisition level as well. So you can track for social loafing and social contribution, and you can track emotionally in terms of emotional attachment and investment. And that's why small-scale hunter-gatherer tribes can operate in a way that is essentially communist, because everyone is literally in it together because they have to be, and they can also track each other. And that's not even looking at other aspects based on. So that's just the individual, the way that the individual mind is contributing to the functioning of an economic system, independent of politics, but then there's all these other political stuff that goes on. There's sociological behaviours that facilitate this equilibrated state. That's why hunter-gatherer tribes are able to survive for hundreds of thousands of years prior to agriculture, because they're functioning in groups of equilibrated states, where they're equilibrated at what's good for the individual within the group is also good for the collective, is also good for in that they're interacting with the environment in a way that's sustainable, because if it wasn't sustainable, they die off because they run out of food and resources. So then there ends up being this equilibrated state between the individual, the group, and the society. But once you expand it out to large scale societies like we're living in, there's obviously the need for these structures because you can't track, and then that's where capitalism is really useful, because it's even independent of innovation, let's say, and dispersed decision making. You just have this. You don't need to track for everyone's contribution and acquisition, because your contribution and acquisition, you're choosing when to do that, and you're able to do it with money, and then it makes up for it. But so I suppose went off on a bit of a tangent there, but I think you covered it really well, where you mentioned this, that there's these individual psychological traits that are there as a result of evolutionary selection pressures. And then that needs to be, that's a core, like that's the fundamental unit at play. They're the building blocks upon which the rest needs to be designed or thought about.
Yeah.
Well, so then not even designs makes it sound like we're trying to come up with a utopia or something. But again, like we discussed last week, that's obviously impossible. But it's like, it's about, I think instead it's like I like these finite and infinite games concept, because it's what way does the equilibration need to take place between the individual and the other three layers in a way that is more like an infinite game and less like a finite game.
We need to think then about what it is about our current game, which is finite. So, as I mentioned before, in terms of resource constraints, Andrew McAfee makes a brilliant case for the fact that actually the more advanced we become, the better we become at using less. His book is literally called More from Less. So whilst that's true, if we can become a culture which is truly neutral in terms of its intake and output of resources, then that's off of the board, and we become infinite in that sense. The other finite factors of the game we're playing is there are the massive global issues that we've discussed in the past, and that could never be better articulated or explicated than in Yuval Noah Harari's writing of the nuclear weapons, the bioweapons, the climate change, artificial intelligence, and technological revolutions, and what was the other one?
No, they're the big three.
The big three. Yeah, no, they're the big three. Yeah, so
climate change and technological disruption.
Yeah, no, exactly. So that is an area in which, so I'm actually less worried than resource constraints than most people. I really do. I have this intuition that humans will figure that side of things out, because the evidence thus far is such that we're moving in the right direction, and I'm hopeful we continue to do so. I don't think that the Earth is in danger of exploding in 10 years lest we get our act together. So with a long enough runway of even a couple decades, I think that we can figure this out. Look at this COVID-19 pandemic, what we've managed to pull together so remarkably quickly under such a short time frame. And this is how fast history can move. Who said it? Is it it was Chomsky, because I'm not a big fan of his, but some time moves not at all, and then months pass in years, and then years occur in months, or something like that.
Yeah, basically, it was a Lenin.
Yeah, no, Lenin. I knew it was somebody I didn't like. Yeah. No, actually, Lenin's probably one of the communists for whom I have the most affinity. But but yeah, it was him. You're right, and I think that's so true. I think we've seen that. I think, given what we're seeing at the moment, time can move so quickly if we need it to. And so I'm not worried about the resource constraints. What I am worried about is I do not see a human capacity for global cooperation, because even in the face of this pandemic, I'm still looking at China and thinking, what aren't you telling us? And that's worrying when we're in the middle of a true pandemic, one that has heretofore not been seen. And we're still looking around us like, I can't trust these people. That's concerning to me. So that's where I'm still I'm in need of reassurance and a signal that things will improve in that arena. I'd like to get your take on that. Basically, what you think in terms of resources, whether you think that is an inherently finite game, or could we make it more of an infinite game within the current system, or with flex within the current system, or whether, and also your opinions on sort of the global issues.
There's I think I definitely, with the resources, take a very optimistic view, just like you do. Where, like we chatted about last week about David Deutsch, I just think that the human ability, so long as we don't wipe ourselves out and we don't get solar flared and get all our technology destroyed, I think we have vast ability to solve problems. And I think there's so much excess, like we discussed last week, so much excess food produced just because of marketing and all this. And I think, especially, like, imagine you have whatever, all 1 billion people in India, that you can, and everyone in China and everyone in South America and Africa, and they're all just able to contribute to problem solving rather than just figure out how to stay alive. There's obviously, they're not all the people in China and Africa, but I mean, let's say the poverty in these areas and different parts of Asia and obviously and Africa and South America is so much poverty. Imagine you just didn't have people that were worrying about surviving. You'd potentially end up with, like we talked about last week, less people because birth rates would slow down, but as women get more educated especially. But then you just have so many more minds able to contribute to the problem solving process. And so I'm just like you. I'm very optimistic about resource production because that's part of the problem solving process. But I suppose I can't help but think as well, and this is potentially a naive bit, but let's say, so at the very beginning of a book called The Infinite Game by Simon Sinek, he was influenced by James Cart. He mentions, like, for example, in this conversation here, right, like neither of us are trying to win. Like, we're both come to this conversation where in this conversation, we'll both leave with a higher understanding, because we're not here. Neither of us are here to defend our points. We're here to learn.
Yeah, this is Rule Omega. Have you heard Jamie Will, Daniel Schmachtenberger, and Jordan Hall talk about Rule Omega?
No.
Yeah, it's effectively, so what its presupposition is there is value in the noise of anything that anybody says. So if somebody says a bunch of garbage to me and there's just 5% of value within the 100%, I take that, I filter it through my mind as best I can, I hopefully add another 5% of value, and then I send it back to you, proportion of value. You then do the same filtering process, and you refine it, and you pull out the value, strip away some of the garbage as best you can, add some of your own value, and it's in that reciprocal process that we end up finding a better truth. We bring ourselves closer to the center of that circle of knowledge, and in that game, like you say, it's that willingness to engage in a dialectic in the hopes that the other person says something that you come away having learned something, and you can go, I didn't know that before. You have the humility to say, I was ignorant before and I'm now slightly more enlightened. And that's what, yeah, as you say, it's not a competition, it's a cooperation. And if anything, it's more selfish than the competition, because actually I win the game if you say more useful things than I do, because I want to learn from this more. Like, it benefits me more to learn from you than it benefits me to teach you. But in teaching you what I know, hopefully that will spark something in you. So actually it ends up just being cooperative, because maybe something I say unlocks something in your head, you think about it differently, and then you give back to me something of which of such high value that I could have never ascertained with my limited mind, because I have my own biases and ways in which I grew up to be me. You have your own. So if I give you some of the input I've taken in, and I get some of the feedback from you, I trust enough in your intelligence that you're going to give me back some real high value content. So it's just a brilliant cooperation. And in that sense, yeah, this is more of an infinite game than a finite one, because we'll never be at an end as to I win so you're dejected and you lose and you walk away. Hopefully we can play the game forever.
Exactly. And think about this. I'm going to listen to that. I remember I remember seeing on a Rebel Wisdom that those three lads had chatted, but I never actually watched it, because as I said last week, I'd never consumed any content from Schmachtenberger until that chat with until the Rebel Wisdom chat, and then the one with Weinstein. So I must go on and I must go back and listen to that. I remember I saw some image of the three lads sitting on a couch. I didn't know that this is what they were talking about, but like think about it. So within that concept, think about what's not that. So if you look at the essence of what you've called rule omega there, and what fits into this kind of what the essence of that is, that we're trying to achieve some kind of what I kind of consider unification. That we're not trying to achieve domination. You know, so
yeah.
So I think there's two different ways of approaching, let's say, the game of life itself. Is that, are you trying to approach the game of life from a place of, are you trying to achieve domination, which is potentially coming from a place of insecurity or a sense of superiority or inferiority relative to the other? You know, it might come from a place of insecurity, or it's just trying to achieve domination because you're navigating the world with regards to relationships of inferiority or superiority relative to the other. Or are you navigating the world from a sense of trying to achieve unification because it's coming from a place of interconnectedness and an extension of what you perceive even your sense of self to be, that you're not. Whereas, so an example would be like, think about this kind of a conversation versus what examples of finite games would be like, say, Nazism, Sunni Wahhabi Salafism, fucking communism, identity politics of any form. Like, they're games based on domination.
Yeah.
that are based on relationships of inferiority or superiority relative to the other. Whereas what we're doing, or if I go to a pub, well, when I can go back to pubs here in Ireland, and I go to something I used to like going to was trad sessions, like traditional Irish music, where there's a group of musicians just show up, they might know each other, might not, and then they just start playing, and like it's just a trad session. They're just people. I could show up with a fucking fiddle or any instrument and just join in, and no one that's there is, if anyone that's playing in that trad session tries to assert how good they are at music, it's out of harmony with the rest of the room. The whole, like, it's so obvious if someone, like, the odd time you see a band on a stage, or you're watching a soccer match and there's a player, or a rugby match, or any sport, and there's a player that's trying to just assert how cool they are or how fucking dominant they are at the expense of everything else, and the disharmony, there's a discordance there that's very uncomfortable. And it's, whereas when everyone is just fitting into this harmony, when it's a team that's functioning well in a sporting scenario, or when it's a trad session, even though they're trying to win, there's a harmony within their group.
Yeah,
you know?
No, I absolutely, I love this, because as you just pointed out in that very last statement, you said the issue with the latter example of the soccer or the rugby games is that is inherent in competition. But if we just take the obvious analogy to what you're describing as a trad session is just jazz. And so if you just take that, the distinction I'm seeing here is basically the distinction between those situations in which you've created incentives where the success of your partner is your success, versus those zero-sum competitions wherein your success is my loss. And so we're looking for those. We're looking for a framework, a structure, a scaffolding that creates the incentives. That means that I wish for your success because your success is my success. So in this conversation, when you say something that makes me go, whoa, that was so good, that's my success as well, because now I've got a new way of thinking. When you talk about the jazz musicians, they are incentivized, or the trad musicians, they are incentivized not to start trying to, look awesome, because actually they're going to do the exact opposite, because the audience are going to go, well, this is trash now, and it's that guy's fault. He's a dick. And the rest of the players are going to go, we're not playing with this dickhead again. And like when he walks in, we're going to say, no, take your fiddle and go home, because every time you try and play, you try and show us everybody up. So he loses. He loses the game, not because he tried to compete and he failed. It's because he tried to compete full stop. The very entrance of competition into the scenario was the failure. And same with football. The person on the team who starts trying to steal the ball, hog it, run it up the pitch, and he keeps getting tackled and having the ball taken away from him, but he never learns to try and actually pass it to somebody else. He ends up being the team player with whom nobody wants to play, who never gets played, and he loses. So you want to create those situations where actually the very entrance of a competitive mindset is the deciding factor as to whether you've succeeded or not. I love this way of thinking.
And think about it even in soccer. Like, even though there's a inbuilt competition in terms of winning and losing, if the soccer players within a team, if they play in such a way that has this harmony within the team and within the constraints of the rule set, then they're playing soccer in such a way that more soccer can be played.
Exactly.
Whereas, so it's still an infinite game, even though within the constraints there happen to be winners and losers in a competition. Whereas think about it, if you look at an extreme example, otherwise, if they just behave like they just break rules, they cheat, they start fights, they get kicked out of the league, they people who watch get annoyed with them. There's a negative connotation within that team and within anyone who watches it. You're playing more of a finite game because you're decreasing the chances of future soccer being able to be played, or future soccer. Because you've literally been thrown out of the league, or you've broken rules, or you pick up the ball and start running with it, whatever. And in those scenarios, what?
No, just the idea of somebody picking up the ball and running with it.
Apparently, that's how rugby began. Was actually a guy called William Webb Ellis in a school called Rugby School picked up the ball during a game of soccer one day, and that's apparently how rugby started. But that's the way the myth goes anyway. I don't know how historical it is, but it's like, so how to play. So if you think about it in terms of, if you look at it from a humility perspective, and you know what, even with regards to constraints, right? So our constraints around incentive structures. I've been thinking a lot about this, and it's like, it's almost like it's incentive structures. I was thinking of it in terms of like, it's almost like if you facilitate situation, if you have constraints that facilitate this rather than enforce it, then we may very well need to enforce it, like the bonobos that beat up that I told you about earlier on. But it's like, if you create a space where the emergence can occur of play in the sense of partaking purely for the joy rather than partaking to achieve domination, then even within a constraint like a sporting scenario where there's winners and losers, then you're potentially still going to end up getting a higher quality of performance, of sport, of actual activity, where, because you're not going to have things like obviously the things like cheating and stuff will be less, because people are partaking for the joy of it rather than partaking which then facilitates more soccer to occur, more rugby to occur, not just for them but en masse, which then leads to better rugby, because a rising tide raises all ships, because then there's more contributing parts, and then everyone wins because everyone wins. And even if there's technically winners and losers within particular events, but it's just so it's this concept of finite and infinite games, or that maps onto this rule omega concept that you mentioned.
My Tesco delivery apparently just turned up, so I'm gonna have to head off, man.
No worries, man. No worries.
End it.